No sword should leave the shop. Today we're going to look at making the scabbard, including saddle straps, for the Medusa's Revenge Kopis. If you like this series, please like and subscribe. I'll put the rest of the series in the comments. We'll start out by using this piece of ash and we'll trace out the shape of the Kopis. Then we're going to actually make sure that we can draw and sheath the sword itself. It's quite fat at the tip, so I'll simply mark the widest point of the blade all the way down the Ashwood. Next, I'm going to create a grid that I can actually measure because it's all curved. There's no straight lines in this thing. And I'm going to actually just measure off along a grid about 3/4 of an inch so that I can actually cut out the actual shape of the scabbard. Then using some dividers, I'm actually going to mark out where the center ridge or the thickest part of the blade is so that I know that I have to grind deeper in that section to accommodate the fattest part of the blade. And then it's just a matter of transferring those marks back onto my grid. And now I know where the deepest part is that I need to grind to. To copy the curve of the bolster, what I'm going to do is use some tape. And with that tape, I'm going to then transfer it to the wood. So very carefully, I'm going to put some tape on the blade, trim it to the shape of the bolster, take the tape off, and then transfer that to the wood. To start grinding it out, I'm going to use the angle grinder, and the first thing I'm going to do is actually mark using just a cutting wheel where all my lines are. I'm going to go down to a depth that I'm just estimating, and then once around the edge, because I need a little bit of depth on the edges as well. This will give me something to grind up to. I use a 40 grit flat disc to grind away the inside of the scabbard, pointing it towards the middle always, following that ridge line that I burned in with the other disc. A quick test fit to make sure we can actually sheath the sword, and then we use that tape from the other step to mark out where the curvature of the bolster actually is. I use a jigsaw to cut out the curvy shape of that bolster, and then it's over to the 2x72 to grind it right up to my lines. A test fit, just to make sure again, we mark out the areas we need to trim up, and then repeat this process over and over and over until I get something I'm satisfied can be sheathed and drawn. This took a long time of fiddling back and forth. And after much playing around, we can actually put the sword into 1/2 of the sheath. Before we can make the other half, what we first of all have to do is transfer all of our measurements to the second half of the Ashwood. In order to do that, what I'm first going to do is cut out the shape of the scabbard, making it a little bit fatter so I can glue it up easier. And then I'm going to transfer that cutout shape to the other piece of wood, cut it out, and then using the dividers again, measure inward from the outward shape. Repeating the grinding process from the first half, we put the two halves together, and now we can actually sheath and draw the sword. Now before we glue the two halves together, I need to know where the inside pocket is so that I can grind up and get a really nice thin piece of wood. So I use the dividers to measure out how far in I can actually go, and then mark it on the outside of the scabbard. To glue up the two halves, I used some epoxy. This was a mistake. You'll see why later. I should have used some wood glue, although I'm not sure it would have made a whole bunch of difference. And for the first time in my life, I don't have enough clamps, so I actually even make use of the little vise I've got sitting there on the bench. After removing the clamps, one final test, just to make sure we didn't get glue in the inside or anything. Quite happy with that. On to sanding. To save a little bit of sanding, what I'm first going to do is trim off a bulk of that extra width we left on there. So I'm shooting for between 1/4 and 3/16 inch around the outside of the sheath before I start shaping it. I started by smoothing out the basic shape, but then I realized there's a lot of wood here to take off. So I headed over to the bandsaw to actually trim off about 50% of the thickness, just a guess. After thinning it out, it's actually remarkably similar to putting the bevels on a blade, except it's just wood. And man, does it make a lot of sawdust. So I simply use the 2x72 and start hogging off material until I get it down to that 3/16 of an inch overall thickness for each side of the scabbard. I use the slack belt portion to help me with the rounds, but it is just time to hog off a lot of wood. I changed belts a couple times, moving up in grit, and in the end, I've got actually a pretty nice, smooth looking scabbard. To protect the wood, what I'm going to do is actually burn it and oil it to protect the wood. I should have noticed when I was doing this on the test piece that I cut off from the outside that it actually caused the wood to curve. And I didn't, which caused me a lot of pain later on. To make the copper fittings, I was originally going to use some copper pipe and hammer it. I did a test piece, didn't like the way it looked at all, so I went back to using some of this 2-inch 1/2 mil copper that I actually used to make the CuMai. I end up wrapping it around using the vise to make some nice hard corners, and we end up with some very nice looking copper fittings to hold the saddle straps. This was just a lot of fiddling because you can't really hammer on the scabbard. It's really thin wood at this point in time. To make the tip, I used the same method by putting tape on, cutting the tape, and then creating a template to cut out of the copper. After about 20 to 25 minutes of messing around, I end up with 3 copper pieces ready to be put on the scabbard. Now it's time to create another disaster. Remember how I said the wood curves when it's burned? Well, it starts looking really, really good. I'm liking the way the grain is showing up. I'm liking the color, and then disaster. The heat melted the epoxy, and the wood wanting to curve created a separation. So at this point, I'm just going to finish the burn. We're going to have to glue it back together. So after taping everything up to make sure I don't get glue on it, I'm marking where the copper fittings go so that I can actually wrap it with tape while the glue dries. I want to wrap it where the fittings go in case I can't get some of the tape off. They'll be underneath the fittings. Turns out I didn't have to worry about this. Everything came out really nice. Time to put on the copper fittings. It's really starting to look nice. Oil it up, And I'm going to use actually some copper rivets to hold the two copper pieces together. Add the tip, and the basic scabbard is finished. The only thing we need to make now are the saddle straps. To make the saddle straps, I'm going to actually use a strap cutter. It's nothing more than a block of wood with a razor blade mounted in it that you can set a fixed width to. This ensures that I get nice even straps instead of trying to use a straight edge and a razor blade. Cut the tips with a paper template just to make sure they're even. I skive the edges of all of the leather. This stops it from rolling over and peeling later. In keeping with the Medusa theme, I'm going to use this snake scale stamp to stamp the strapping. And then finally, I'm going to add my touch mark to the end of one of the straps. With the straps stamped, it's now time to stain them. I'm going to use an airbrush, some Fibings Pro. I wish we could get this in Canada, but the government's decided it's too dangerous for us to use. We'll start with the saddle brown dye. Of course, because it's a cavalry sword, we should use saddle brown. And we'll make sure that we hit both sides with a couple coats. Next, I want to add a black edge to the strapping. I start off the workpiece to make sure I've got the correct dye and airflow, and then simply hit all of the edges, the backside included. The last step is to hit the edges with some black dye because the spray doesn't actually go there. So I use a Q-tip and I run along the entire edge with the black dye just to make sure we've got full coverage. Back to the leather room to add the straps, simply with some leather rivets. And we actually can call this scabbard now complete. I'm really happy with the way this product turned out. The copper and the black stands out amazingly. The leather straps complement the Medusa theme. And as always, if you like, please like and subscribe.